We are excited to welcome you here today to the Potomac Institute for our Critical Minerals course with our course director, Sarah Monero. And so we've got some great faculty lined up for you. I've got a couple of slides to go through really quickly just to give you some background on us. So for those of you online, we really want this to feel like a discussion and we want you to be present as much as possible. So if you can keep your camera on, if you're in a position to do that, that will be great. Remember to keep your mics muted unless you're speaking to the crowd. Ideally, it'd be great to keep your outside work to a minimum. I know we're all busy, but you paid to be here. So we really want you to take it in as much as possible and be part of the conversation. There it is, engage in the chat and conversation. So you can use the chat feature. I'll be monitoring the chat, or raise your hand on Zoom and I can kind of pull you in that way. And then the last thing is just stay comfortable. We're gonna be here for a while. We've got some breaks built in so that everyone can get up and move because it's important to do that. And this is our agenda. We're gonna start off with an introduction from Sarah, and then we have our partner ETI coming in to speak to us as well. And then I think you've all pretty much seen this, so we'll move on from here. And if you have not logged into Canvas, I do want to just make sure that you have access to it. That's going to be the hub, essentially. You can find out about all of the participants who are here. You'll more details about your presenters, your faculty members, and also the presentations will be available there for about a month. We'll keep the course open, so you will have access to Canvas. And from there, just a couple intro. We have wanted to let you know a little bit about General Alfred Gray, who is our chairman of the board here, retired U.S. Marine Corps. So just that's all on our bio. Dr. Jennifer Buss is our CEO. She'll be in later on this afternoon to welcome you. And I am now going to turn it over to our course director. But before I do, for those of you here, with bathrooms, really important. You can go right outside the glass doors beyond the elevators, and the code is 123. Easy day, right? And then we also have some inside, but it's just a little bit further of a walk. Just go down the hallway here and it'll be on your left. All right. And with that, I'm going to wait for, I'm going to turn it over to you. Hello.
All right. So give us a little bit of grace as we do kind of a hybrid approach here with people sitting in the room and y'all online, but Keisha said we want to make sure that this is, you know, a dialogue. It will be really, really boring, and it is not the intent to have myself or any of the faculty just talk at you guys for 8 hours. That's pretty painful. All right, so my name is Sarah Monero. I'm the course director for this course with the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. I have about 15 years in DoD and national security ecosystem doing, primarily I'm a space nerd by all accounts. So I started out at the sprawling metropolis of Dayton, Ohio, working at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base at the National Air and Space Intelligence Center as a counter space analyst. I got pulled up to go work in OSD policy, the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy, doing space stuff primarily, and then I did space, missile defense, nukes, the Korea desk, the Brazil desk, cyber, IO, kind of all over the place. And then I made quite frankly, like weird tactical life decisions that took me to the Hill, where I was the Strategic Forces staff director for the House Armed Services when we were doing things like standing up Space Force. A lot of fun, still out here working as like a space nerd, but I will tell you that talking about critical minerals, rare earth elements, rare earth oxides, and figuring out how that supply chain works and facilitates defense programs has been something that I've touched throughout multiple places in my career. I've also, to be real honest with you, I looked at a bunch of your bios that you guys submitted in your applications, and quite frankly, like a bunch of you guys could probably teach this course. And so again, like looking for and encouraging your input. I think, you know, for me, what I'll do is I'll provide you kind of a baseline introduction to critical minerals, just because there are people here of different kind of exposure to the challenges in the baseline. And then I'll get into, quite frankly, what is my area of expertise, which is executive branch and legislative branch actions and reactions. We've got some great faculty here, again, really well qualified people. Al Schaefer is going to be lecturing after me. If you don't know Al, you should. He's been around for years and years. I mean, 24 years in the Air Force, and then another significant amount of time in the Pentagon, doing things like being the DUSD, so the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. He is really an expert on the RDT&E architecture and processes within the Department of Defense, operational energy plans and programs. So he'll be doing the section primarily on defense programs and requirements. What are the actual requirements for critical minerals, and how does that support the defense programs? We've got Mr. Eric Bender here as well. He is the VP of Strategy for a company called Tronox. I thought it was important, quite frankly, not to just have government people talk to government people. And I wanted to specifically get industry perspective on, you know, how industry is dealing with both the executive and legislative action that drive right now kind of critical minerals, but also what is the industrial point of view on kind of all of this action and where it's going. And then we're going to wrap up with DASD Najib Locke, Halima. She is phenomenal. She is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Industrial Base Resilience in the DoD. And so she is the person responsible for a bunch of the DPA Title III stuff and activity that goes on. And she has also had significant experience on the Hill in places. So it will be great. I want to turn it over to Arun Seraphin, who's a friend and mentor out here. We are co-sponsoring this course with NDIA and their ETI Institute, of which Arun is associated. We appreciate that. Quite frankly, we appreciate not only the association with NDIA, but the mentorship and the friendship of the individuals that work. And so he's got a couple of slides, and we're going to let him run through those, and then you can correct anything that I've messed up already, because this is pretty much how Arun and I work.
Sarah, thanks, and thanks everyone. I'm Arun Seraphin, Deputy Director at the Emerging Technologies Institute. I am happy that we can co-sponsor this event with Potomac Institute, and it's great that you all are taking the time to put this together. The Potomac team put together an incredible group of people to speak, including Sarah, who I've known for a long time, and Al and Halima, and I think it's going to be a great experience. I would say this, I'm a person who's worked in Washington for about 25 years. I am first blessed to have a technical background, it turns out, in material science, but I sort of lost that a long time ago and worked on Capitol Hill and in the White House and the Pentagon and now at NDIA all these years. But I've seen Washington struggle mightily with hard technical issues. And often part of the problem is when something too hard comes across your plate and you sometimes have not enough time to think about it, or often too embarrassed to admit you don't understand what you're looking at, really bad things can happen. Personal experience, the first time I recall rare earths being discussed behind closed doors by the members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, most of the conversation got wrapped around the axle of a senator saying out loud, I have no idea what rare earths are, other than that rock group from the 60s, which I honestly still don't know if there really was a rock group called the rare earths in the 60s.
There was.
The other senators loved it, and that ate a huge amount of time, and who knows what happened afterwards. So I just think it is fantastic that you and your organizations allow you to take the time to think about these things. And I think, look, we're never going to get PhDs in rare earths or supply chain studies or whatever it is in these kinds of courses. I think what we can get is perspectives from people in other sectors, understanding of the interfaces between those different sectors, resources so that we can get smart to deliver the products we need to our bosses over time. And I think that's the value in these kinds. And I think that's one of the reasons, segueing over, that NDIA established this Emerging Technologies Institute is, you all might be familiar with NDIA. I'm probably not actually going to go through these slides, but just leave that one. Like, it's the world's largest defense industry trade association. You think of NDIA as the place to go to learn about what the Navy is going to do next in shipbuilding, what the Army is going to do next in ground vehicles. And there's a feeling that we haven't focused enough on emerging technologies. And so the NDIA board, the NDIA leadership has stood up a team, and I'm part of this team. It's led by Dr. Mark Lewis, at least for the near term, who is a former assistant undersecretary in R&E in the Pentagon. And our goal is to let the NDIA membership participate in the conversation on how emerging technologies are going to shape the future of the military, of national defense, to tell the story about how defense industry can help drive those technologies, and to help Washington policy makers understand industry perspectives on those kinds of what new technologies should we be investing in kinds of questions, as well as what's the policy environment that we need to have to make sure those technologies move as efficiently into the hands of operational users as possible. So I think it's a noble goal, and we're going after it. Can you flip actually? See if I can get one of that stuff to do. We're going to try to go after it using a bunch of different flip. That's what NDIA is. I'll leave these slides behind for everyone. Go to the next. These kinds of things. So, we do informational things like podcasts. Every other week, podcast drops. You can go to our YouTube site, see me hosting or Mark Lewis hosting, interviewing interesting people. We do studies and reports. I think Jordan, I saw his name on the screen, who's going to be in this class with you all. He's working on a supply chain study on directed energy. We've done supply chain studies on hypersonics, doing work on ethics of the use of autonomous weapon systems on the battlefield. So there's think tanky style, Potomac style, deeper dive studies, but also these kinds of educational sessions for our membership. We do a monthly Tech 101 series. If you give us an hour, we can make you an hour more dangerous about something like quantum computing or directed energy, or how a laser works. And it's not intended, if you've got a master's degree in lasers, they're not invited, right? It's for people who just want to learn a little bit about a new technology. We do those kinds of things. We're doing webinars. So for example, on Thursday, we're doing a webinar with Heidi Shue and the other deputy assistant secretaries for all the S&T leads in the services, Army, Navy, DARPA, Air Force. They're going to roll out their budget requests for FY20, whatever, 24. And so that's going to be a virtual event that's free. If you go to our website, you can actually sign up and see this 2 hours of the S&T executive showing off to the NDIA members what's going on. So these are the kinds of activities we're going to try to be doing. One, I don't know how many of you all are NDIA members, but don't really care. If you've got ideas for the kinds of things that you think will help shape that dialogue, either educationally, writing a paper, we really are not going to be the kind of place that can beat them at doing a 100-page deep dive, 150-page deep dive study. We're really gonna be the kind of people that's gonna be more in that educational space, that pointing out the specific policy recommendations to be made, and bringing that industry voice, university voice into this kind of conversation. So with that, I will get off the stage, say thank you again to Sarah for all the time we got to spend together and what you're gonna do here today. We're looking forward to doing events like this in the future with Potomac. If you've got ideas of other areas you'd like us to take on, we'd be happy to consider that work. So hopefully you have a great day. I'm gonna have to leave because I already know all this. I got a PhD in material science, so
Also, he was from the Senate, so he's way fancy.
it's also that. So I'm just gonna walk out with that.
Yeah, you should, I mean, the Senate typically walks in late, drops some truth bombs that are terribly uninformed, and then leaves.
So I haven't done that. I will now.
Yeah. Everyone is
Thank you all.
fantastic. NDIA, I'm just gonna say, is a fantastic organization that has really attracted some top talent in the past few years. So they have my old boss there, Jen Stewart. They've got Arun there, they've got Mark Lewis, they've got Dave Norquist. I mean, really fantastic stuff. Also, just really interesting work. I think as we, as a nation and as an ecosystem, think about how we are best leveraging the contributions of industry in the broader S&T community, right? And so that I consistently look at NDIA for those kinds of contributions and bringing those voices to the table. I would highly recommend being involved with them to the extent that you guys can. It is also my pleasure to personally vouch for a lot of these people in DC. Finding good people is really difficult because DC is a painfully transactional town. I will tell you, the people that I know at NDIA are genuinely good. So, okay. Also, Mike says hi. I saw a bunch of stuff on a bunch of stuff on the chat.
Yes, those were more like for me.
Okay, great. Again, working the hybrid thing, just give me a little bit of grace because
Someone said
it's a lot
yay
to
to
manage.
any SIC encounter space.
Oh,
So that was-
nice.
that was
Oh,
for you.
yeah, I love it.
But the others were logistics.
Okay, and because we have people in the room and we've got people online and we are encouraging dialogue, if and when you guys have questions, like just one, if you're online, let Lakeisha know. If you're here, just shout them out. Before you shout them out, please introduce yourself and your organization, just so that we have kind of an understanding of who you are and your perspective and where you guys are coming from. I will tell you that this is like a non-attribution environment. We're not looking to make press articles out of this. We want this to be an honest and safe conversation.
Ready to see.
Y'all don't want to see my face.
Okay.
The charts are better.
Back to you.
Technology.
Erica,
You want to grab Erica?
here it is. There we go.
We're good.
We're good.
All right, giddy up, guys. And we are, what is this? Ahead of schedule. It's amazing. I hope you're all well kept. Here we go. Everyone, thanks for stopping by. Tell
Yeah.
Jen I said hi.
Okay.
All right, next slide. All right, this is the agenda of my session. So my session is basically gonna go from now until about 10:30, 10:45-ish. Again, this is not meant to give you a master's or a PhD in the subject. Quite frankly, most of you guys actually already have masters or PhDs in subjects that are adjacent to or terribly relevant to this. What it is meant to do is for the rest of us to give us kind of a baseline of what we're talking about. and to set some kind of definitional kind of background. And then we'll probably get into, and then what we'll do is we'll talk about the so what. So I started as an Intel analyst, and so the first thing they tell you as an Intel analyst is like, don't bore us with a bunch of your Intel, but like actually tell us what the heck this means. Why does it matter, right? So we'll do a little bit of that. I will tell you that Al Schaefer is probably going to talk more in depth about that from the defense perspective, and I think that will be great. I will then dig into some of the policy issues, which is really kind of my area of expertise, and what are we doing about it as a whole government perspective. And actually, we have a couple of people in the room here and a couple of people online that can help contribute to that discussion as well. I should also warn everybody that I talk really fast. And so if I need to slow down, please somebody just reach out and slap me. But this is the agenda for a little bit. Go ahead and press. All right, let's just jump in. What is a critical mineral? And who decided that these things were critical? So the Energy Act of 2020 defines a critical mineral. We good? As a non-fuel mineral or a mineral material essential to economic or national security of the US, which has a supply chain vulnerable to disruption. There's a couple of really interesting parts of this definition. Okay, so one is this act defines critical mineral as a non-fuel mineral, which is different from in the past. So this is one of the reasons why uranium is now not actually defined as a critical mineral. There was much consternation about this in the rule posting that USGS kind of put out for public comment. You can find all of that online if you like, because it was actually a rule that was subject to public comment, and as well as their adjudication online. So that was really fascinating to see. If you're a nerd, if you're here, I'm going to assume that you're a nerd, because only nerds take these classes, and I'm here to celebrate that. But what the Energy Act of 2020 also did was direct the Department of Interior, and specifically the USGS, to update the list every 3 years about what minerals are going to be defined as critical. And as a part of that process, they had to develop a methodology by which they would be assessing the criticality of the minerals. And the two main metrics that they used for defining criticality was supply chain vulnerability, whether there was a single point of failure for the supply chain, or whether the supply chain was vulnerable specifically to disruption from foreign competitors, namely China, and we'll talk a significant amount about that later in this section. So what's important here to know is that the critical mineral list, and we'll go through that. It includes, again, 50 minerals, was just published in 2022. Again, will be relooked at every 3 years. But I think the most interesting thing here is to actually, if you guys are interested, is to go and find the actual rule that USGS and the Department of Interior published, and then look at the public comments, and then look at USGS's response to those public comments. And that, I think, is really kind of fascinating to do. It's a kind of a deeper nerdy cut, but for people that are interested in technical areas, and like Arun said, you know, one of the things that's really challenging in this town and working in some of these kind of higher, more technical, high technology kind of areas, that a lot of people will talk about this stuff. But you should really kind of dig down into, quite frankly, like the organizations that I go to for a lot of this are CRS, GAO, CBO. But going and looking at the public rulemaking is a good deep cut for people in the industry and in the government. So critical mineral The other thing that you should know that's important about this definition, it's essential to the economic or national security, right? Like those are the other two big words that are kind of thrown out here. And so I come from a very defense and intelligence heavy background. I will tell you that the discourse that's going on in this town and this country right now about critical minerals is much broader than defense and intel, right? So it is very much about clean energy and that clean energy transition, which has spurred a lot of executive action. It's associated with CHIPS Act and CHIPS Act implementation and STEM education. And it is outside, quite frankly, the comfort zone of a lot of people that have historically looked at critical minerals as part of our defense stockpile initiatives, as part of kind of defense programs. And so, you know, it's a really fascinating and emerging kind of ecosystem in DC that is broadening out. And so it's one of the reasons why we structured this course to kind of have, again, a DoD-centric kind of speaker, but also bringing in industry points of view, and then talking a little bit about kind of DPA and that process and how that helps, right? And so this is actually a really interesting point that will be kind of pulled through the rest of the course today. Next. So again, here's the list. I'm sure that Eric can tell you about all of these things. Like he's honestly worked with these things. Also John, by the way, like have worked with these elements, quite frankly, longer than some of these people that are in this course have been alive, right? Like it's a lot, but this is what came out of, again, the USGS kind of process about which specific minerals there are. This is a lot for me. So next slide. So here we go, just to like really nerd out, right? So this is the list in a visual format that is kind of, you know, here's everything from the periodic table, everything from like lithium, beryllium, right? So everything in this goldish color up here, right, is on the critical minerals list right now. Everything in this silver color was previously on the list and is not on the 22 list. So again, some of this uranium is the big one that people had a big fit about. Again, going back to the definition of non like energy producing, right? So they pulled that out. Uranium as a nuke nerd, still very important, but not on the critical minerals list. So again, this is an important distinction to make, that just because it's important doesn't mean that it definitionally is recognized as critical within the bounds of the USGS and the Department of Interior designation. I'm gonna pause here because this is a lot. I'm laying a lot down. Do you want to say something, Eric?
I was just gonna say, I have the same exact slide, so what doesn't get covered now will get covered later.
Right, and you can go into like every single one of these. Nerdy.
It's kind of like the masters, you know, if you're one of the goals, you kind of get it. It's like you're getting a green jacket, but on the ones in gray, the green jacket got taken away. So it's kind of you think you're in for life, but you know, it comes and goes, but it's quite fascinating.
It is, and like I said, you know, for me as a person who loves to get their hands on primary source documentation and to see kind of the conversation that happens between the government and industry. Again, watching the comments that roll in on the public rulemaking is really fascinating. And by the way, like public rulemaking is a thing that is not strictly related to just critical minerals. Basically, anytime that the government has a public rule that they publish, they are required to intake and account for and adjudicate public comments to those. And so in the space world, there's a lot of this, right, about space debris, about different kinds of, licensing and regulatory issues. Same with critical minerals, right? And so getting those perspectives, I think, is valuable. Next slide. So a rare earth element. So I think in the discourse around town, people use these terms interchangeably. And the bottom line is that they're not interchangeable per se, right? And there are different, they are different. So one, quite frankly, rare earth elements are not terribly rare. It's kind of a misnomer. They are rare in the sense that, like, you can't walk on the street and pick one up and it's a pure kind of element, right? It requires a significant process to go through and actually extract and separate and then be able to, metallize. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Honestly, again, Eric is the expert on that. But it is 15 elements that are referred to as lanthanoids or lanthanides sometimes, if you want to get Greek with it, apparently. But they're basically broken into light and heavy REEs or REOs. They're also called rare earth oxides. Based on their atomic weight, there is an exception because there's always an exception. The exception is yttrium, which apparently has a low atomic weight, but behaves like a heavy, and so they categorize it. It is the rare earth elements, quite frankly, that a significant amount of defense applications focus on, and specifically a bunch of the actions relating to DPA, Title III kinds of things end up working on specifically the light and heavy REOs. Let's just, the next slide will look familiar. Well, so this is the 15 that are broken out. If you have worked in kind of high technology areas dealing with semiconductors, with metal alloys, with rockets, rocket motors, with optics and fiber optics, with lasers, you will recognize a lot of these REs. They are in a lot of programs, and we'll talk a little bit about this, but we'll also, like I said, have Al kind of talk even more in depth about the defense requirements perspective for these kinds of materials. Next slide. So what I just wanted to do here is, again, because I'm a visual person, is bring back this chart and then just kind of highlight the subsection, right, of the periodic table that are actually classified as REEs. So we have the list for people that can absorb that. Again, this makes sense. I will tell you, the one that, like, I just didn't pull out is promethium because it's so, I don't really talk about it.
It's 500 grams in the world.
Exactly, like it's so rare that like people don't even bother classifying it, just getting it in the ass. But there we go. This is what you're looking at. I will tell you that legislative action and executive action has, in the past few years, really blossomed on scandium, neodymium, praseodymium, yttrium. I mean, you see a lot of people throwing around those terms, whether or not they actually know these. But that's what the REs look like. I feel like I've already done a lot of talking. Do we have questions or?
Any questions in the virtual world? Or in person? So this should be updated.
So they will start the process for updating it next year. And the comments, and there is a standard, they will be required, so the Department of Interior through USGS will be required to initiate that process again. And that will have a comment period and then an adjudication period. They may go out for multiple comments. I know they got about around 1,700 comments on the last cycle, which took them a significant amount of time to go through and adjudicate and address. And so usually the updating of the list is anticipated to take about 18 months from when they start. So yeah, that process will start again. Yeah.
Susan, Dennis Bartow here. Thank you for this course. It's wonderful. I wonder maybe if you could provide some kind of insight on why, just for instance, helium was removed from this list. Like somebody lobbied against it. Was it too much helium? Like why would something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's an interesting question. Again, like there's a lot of discussion about this in the rulemaking and about the removal and the movement that goes back and forth. I tend not to believe that it was like a lot of lobbying per se, in the classical sense of lobbying, right? So I tend to believe that what the Department of Interior and USGS did was look at, and again, the published metrics that they had were about supply chain and supply chain vulnerability. Helium in particular doesn't have a single point of failure for extraction, so it didn't meet that metric. And the supply chain disruption from foreign adversaries was also marked as not being as critical of an issue for helium. So it's not, and we can talk about this, I think, kind of later in the policy issue, is there is definitely lobbying that goes on. I think, like I said, the one that people probably saw the most vociferous Hill lobbying action on was uranium. And you saw that through multiple committees. Quite frankly, the USGS through the Department of Interior hears that, but is not lobbied in the same way that Congress is, right? To directly inject whether or not that element is going to be on the list for critical minerals. They still have a rigorous methodology that they need to go through to be able to do that. And it just didn't, it didn't meet those standards.
Yeah, because I dabble a little bit in helium, and once upon a time when I was in the military legislative system, probably the same time when you were running around there, task or whatever, we had one refinery in Texas doing helium.
Yeah.
And now I've got several helium projects in the United States, Australia, Greenland, and some others, and they are saying, well, this is essential for chip. This is, we're running out of it here and there and there. So to see it kind of drop off, like, well, is there a problem? Anyway, so.
Yeah, and this is a great point, is the US critical minerals list is not necessarily the world's critical minerals list. So the EU has a different standard and a different methodology for what they consider critical minerals. Australia, which is fascinating because they actually do have access to ore and mines, and they have a different list. Canada, again, with different mineral deposits, has a different list. And so there are deviations in the global policy community about what is defined as critical. The US definition, being dependent upon US national security, makes it, particularly, interesting to us. In the policy community as well, there's a broader discussion about nearshoring, friendshoring, right? Sourcing. There's a whole discussion to be had about supply chain. How far back in the supply chain do you go? Quite frankly, the raw materials for a lot of these things are in not politically stable places and or in places where we're in direct competition, i.e. China. And so, the responsibility for the policy community is to think about, you know, how far back in the supply chain do you want to go to be able to figure out the provenance of your material and how you're able to do that from extraction all the way through processing. And so, again, that's something that we'll continue to talk about. Hopefully that answered some of it, especially with kind of helium and then the different kinds of
Talking about
perspectives.
copper layer.
Oh, yeah, copper. It's a good one too.
Okay, thanks, Susan.
All right, anybody else?
David Eastman, Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. So kind of along a similar line, you said, you know, helium is maybe not considered anymore on the list because it doesn't have the supply chain vulnerability necessarily. Is that sort of a newer criteria for this list, or is there just more emphasis on the supply chain aspect?
Yeah,
So
so
I know
this,
certainly like compared to 2018, it's totally different now, especially, I know you get into China. It's certainly changed a lot.
yeah, so this was, this cycle of rulemaking for USGS was the first time that they were really very forward leaning and in talking about their specific methodology. And quite frankly, like there were three basic metrics, right? So the first one was supply chain was vulnerable to disruption. The second one was single point of failure or basically like a single point of failure in supply chain. And the third one was like a catch-all. It was like quantitative and qualitative analysis on the third. So, and it was really interesting to see that. I think what will continue to happen is as this continues to go through and spin through the next cycle of determining what is going to be on that list, they're going to need to come back and continue to refine the methodology. And as like nerd, like that's fascinating to me. Like what else? Like if 2 out of the 3 of the metrics for the 22 list were all about supply chain, at what point do those metrics start to broaden? And you know, if you want to get like real nerdy, like how do you influence the metrics that Department of Interior and USGS will use to determine, you know, the criticality and the assignment in the business, right? And that's where like influencing and lobbying comes in, which is, but certainly for this go around, it was all about supply chain and their perception, both qualitative and quantitative, about risk to supply chain. And quite frankly, like, again, one of my big things through a whole bunch of areas is like, not all risk is the same, right? Not all supply chains are the same. Like people throw this out, they're like, oh, this is a supply chain. Like, well, there are different supply chains, right? And there are different ways of looking at supply chains. And there are different ways of addressing and mitigating risk, right? And so looking through all of that, I think will be interesting.
Yeah, because part of my curiosity is, you know, they remove some, is it, you know, looking forward, do we continue to remove some and focus on like the ones that are more and more critical to broaden it more, you know, it's just a curiosity.
Yeah, I mean, I have no idea
Yeah.
what the Department of Interior will do or what USGS will do. The other thing that I will say is a lot of this, again, going through the Energy Act of 2020, is really looking for a way to help expedite clean energy transition. And so even though it was not a metric that was assigned in the criteria selection that was published by USGS and Department of Interior, the fact that it was carried in that legislative vehicle colors that lens. And so the next legislative action that happens on this, it will be interesting to see if that colors the lens as well. And like Eric, this would be an interesting perspective for you, is like of the things that dropped off of the list or the changes in the list from 2018 to 2022, would be interesting to know how much of that industry perceives as being driven by magnet production and clean energy production versus like defense applications or things like that.
Ones that dropped off, yeah, helium I don't know a lot about, other than the comment made regarding the facility in Texas. Potassium is widely available. You know, it's commonly produced through to produce KOH, caustic, it's a form of caustic. KCl is widely available. You could make chlorine, which is a big unit consumer in the United States, to make PVC typically, either through salt, regular table salt, NaCl, or KCl. And there are facilities that make both, and one was recently expanded. So I'm not sure if that one had anything to do with it, but potassium can be made easily from those. So I don't see any of these as the same. I think there are flashing red kind of critical elements, if you will, and then there are some that are probably yellow. Use the stoplight, you know, analogy. I think they're in different baskets and they're not all the same. My guess is potassium is one that's probably widely available. Can be produced quite easily. Needs a little bit of investment, but you can get there. Rare earths, much bigger problem. You know, scandium, I think, you know, scandium is one that we could produce at any one of our facilities quite easily through our tailings. Just a matter of capturing that material. We know how to do it. It's just not particularly interesting economically to do. But if the government needed it, you know, a small check would get you over the line on that. Quite easily, frankly. So I think they're not all the same. I think the rare earths are probably rightfully focus area because much more complicated, much more technical, much more investment, much larger investments.
Eric, do you mention potassium? I'm a little deaf.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I actually work on potash.
Yeah.
And we import 96% of it to the United States. So it's part of the 3 commercial fertilizers with nitrogen, which comes from natural gas, which not many people know. Then you got your phosphorus, which we have, urea, but then the potassium, the part of it, the potash we import. So that's one where I don't know where that would fit on here, you know, but yeah.
It probably fell off because you could import the material from a friendly country.
Canada, but we get 40%
Correct.
from Russia and Belarus. That's the goals. So
I mean, titanium is on there. Titanium is widely available right now. It's something we know a lot about. I'll talk about it actually in my presentation. Same kind of thing. We make no titanium sponge, US and Europe.
All right, let's press. Whoa, this is where we're getting. This is where we're going. Actually, this is a good conversation. It's almost like we planned this, guys. So look, at the end of the day, it's not the it's not the case that you can like go out and just like pick this stuff up out of the ground and it's like there in concentrated usable form that you can actually. And this is one of the reasons, again, that I wanted to bring in both kind of a government perspective and an industry perspective, because, you know, as Eric just said, you know, this is really capital intensive. And there has to be economic upside for the creation of this. But just so everybody is baseline, and again, we have experts here that can kind of talk through what all of this actually is and how it works, but you got to find the thing in the mine or the ore, right? You've got to find the thing in the ground. You got to get it out of the ground somehow. It's usually open pit mining, or, you know, or some sort of mining. You got to literally take that ore, take those elements, and then basically get them to a chemical state, right? You do that through hydrometallurgical operations. These have really appealing names like cracking and leaching or acid baking, right? Like really friendly sounding names. But the bottom line is most of this stuff comes associated or as part of much kind of messier aggregates that you've got to be able to bake out. You've got to separate those things. And so this is, you know, an area that it is Eric's kind of specialty, but you know, a lot of the REOs, you find them together, but you find them in a messy state that has to be extracted and separated, right? So there's a whole process for that. And then you've got to figure out how to metallize it or put it into some sort of an alloy or put it into something. And then you're producing it. So whether it's like a magnet, right? And you're doing magnet production there, or, you know, quite frankly, a lot of this also ends up going back and then being reused and recycled. But at the end of the day, there is a significant process that goes through and starts at the ore, goes through a lot of refinement, separating and processing that is very capital intensive, and then gets it to a state where you can actually use it and produce it at mass and at scale. And that's a really tricky process. And we're going to hear from, again, industry perspectives on what that looks like, as well as kind of the economic kind of case about that, as well as the government perspective on how government can help to support industry as they're considering making some of those kinds of investments. Because it is not necessarily the case that it is like economic greenfield for everybody to extract these extremely rare like elements that are, quite frankly, very essential, i.e. critical, to our defense programs and to our national security. And so it is within the best interest of the government to be able to help support that and create a framework for that. They've done that as a whole of government perspective. Again, I'll talk a little bit about that. That's kind of the second half of the discussion here, but it's an intensive process that that all of these go through to get to a usable state. Next slide. Oh, this is the so what. So as an intel analyst, you're always told like, what is the so what? Again, a very defense and intel perspective heavy, you know, thing from CRS. Look, I'm gonna hype another CRS report here. So this is the breakdown of rare earth materials used to make each one of these systems. And this is like for every actual like F-35. So just to give you guys a sense of scale here. So if there's like 920 pounds in an F-35, cool. I mean, F-35, you know, look, I only care about things that fall to the earth, but people care about flying things as well, apparently. 1,700, like about 1,700 F-35s we're on contract for the United States, right? Arleigh Burks, I think there's like 70 out right now. The order is for 90, right? Virginia class submarines, gotta love a good Virginia class submarine. It's like, I think 66 is the order that we're at right now. So just in these 3 programs, right, you're talking about well over 2.5 million pounds of these elements, right, that have to go through that process. That's a tremendous amount of capacity that we're gonna need for these defense programs. And these are just 3 of them. They're important 3. We'll give you that. Next. They're also in like almost every defense program that we have. So the AIM-9X that went out and like, you know, shot down a balloon recently. I mean, it does more than shoot down balloons, but yay for that. REEs are very important for rotary wing alloys. Again, I'm a missile person, a space person, but helicopters important. There's a huge push and use for rare earth elements in radars, whether they're in optics, so whether they're for tanks or defense system. Use their JDAMs specifically, use a lot of REs, Tomahawks, and nuclear, here we go. So what I was trying to drive at here is, yes, the huge programs use rare earth elements and are anticipated to, quite frankly, every domain. And there are multiple programs in every domain that use and depend on the alloys and the rare earth elements and the critical minerals to be able to meet our defense requirements and capacity, right? Next slide. Again, space nerd, Ayo. It didn't fit on the other slide, so I just pulled it out on its own because again, space. Starfire, which is, I think, still technically the world's largest adaptive optics system and laser system. Huge nerd. Love it. If you guys ever get the chance to go out to Albuquerque and see a huge laser shot into space, do it. It's amazing. Clearly, GPS, not only the birds that are flying, but also, quite frankly, a bunch of the users and terminals rely on critical minerals. And I tried to find a picture with like a whole bunch of launch vehicles so that I'm not, because they're in like a weird source selection right now. But space launch vehicles, things that use solid rocket motors, have very specific uses for critical minerals in the alloys that they have for their launch capacity. Next slide. I think we're getting to a break. Let's take a breather because I've talked a lot. It's a lot of talking at you. I think after this, we'll start to get into kind of the policy, some of the challenges in the policy, but I just wanted to give people a breather because I've been talking for a long time and you all need to probably caffeinate. What's up? Do you have a question?
Yes.
What's your name?
Also from Johns Hopkins Lab.
Oh, great.
So I have a question about like the rare earth dependency breakdown for each programs. Are you aware of like if the programs are doing like assessments of dependency in a layer or 2 layers down, like by component, rather than like a whole system overview?
Al is gonna be your big person there that'll talk to that. And I think Halima might be able to talk to a bunch of that as well because she's doing a bunch of supply chain. Dennis is burning to say something. Go ahead.
So I was the former DoD small business director, so I worked with Helena when she would pull me in there, give me a wag of the finger about things. But there's mission assurance offices that hang on Homeland Defense, policy and OSD kind of keeps a list. So does, believe it or not, Department of Homeland Security. It's all under mission assurance, and then they do like a mission decomposition. And the tricky part to all this is that there is that list, and then there is that list. Okay, so there's things that, now I'm in industry, that list is great, but like, I can talk about scandium and some of the things like that, but there's ones that they're concerned about for R&D purposes, for commercialization purposes. The way the government buys, the way they do things. So you've heard about SIBR, sitters, RIFs, the Valley of Death, all these different things. When the government buys, it has to put things out to bid and do that process. So sometimes there's single points of failure just in the purchasing, which we could get into, but I don't want to. That's kind of the broader, but Al, I work for Al, so he'll know a lot better.
Take a break, get some coffee. Turn your mics off, guys. Sorry, turn your cameras on.
Oh, okay. Hey. So, fine.
We'll get 10-minute break.
Yeah.
So
you guys grew up together here? No, yeah.
Right. I'm kind of like my thank you cards.
Oh, we went to grad school
I just,
together.
oh, you were. Oh, so you were.
Yeah.
Fellow.
Yeah.
I'm struggling.
Yes, what's up, what's up?
It's funny.
This is actually where it gets interesting.
Yes. Just so you know, that way, in case I have to run in there again to assist, there is another bathroom all the way down at the end of the hall that way. And that way you don't have to leave the doors, you don't have a code.
Technology. Love it. Look, the second half of my presentation is gonna be setting up the rest of the day, which is basically policy issues and what the whole of government we have and are continuing to do to address the critical minerals and REO issue. So the first policy issue is clearly China, right? And it is clearly China. And it is because China is dominant over basically that entire process of that entire value chain process that we talked about earlier, right? That kind of everything from mining to hydrometallurgical ops to separation. In almost every one of those steps, if not all of those steps, basically every one of those steps, and Eric can talk about this in his presentation. I know he's well versed in this from working from an industry perspective. China has about 90 to 95% market share in almost every one of those steps. In 2018, the US imported 98% of its processed RE from China. That is a tremendous amount. For us to, as a nation, to acknowledge that our economy and security is dependent on a supply chain that is being imported almost exclusively from China, while at the same time acknowledging that we are in a pretty robust strategic competition with China, clearly needs to be addressed. It is also no surprise that China uses its market share dominance in RAEs to better position itself and preserve its own national security interests, which are in conflict with a rules-based order that the administration and the United States is trying to support. So the most visceral example of this happened after a boat collision in 2010 in the Senkakus with Japan, where, you know, they have this collision and then all of a sudden there is new export restrictions coming out of China and price manipulation on access to feedstock and rare earth elements. You see that. This was actually such a drastic shock to the system that at the time, the United States filed with several other companies or countries a dispute with the World Trade Organization, which we won, that basically said and acknowledged that China had manipulated both access to and prices of REs for their political leverage. It is something that has motivated specifically the defense and the intel community, but the broader action that you've seen from the executive branch, from the White House and the legislative branch, right? And so you see a lot of talk, and we'll talk about this as well, but a lot of the legislative vehicles talk about critical minerals and access to critical minerals and rare earth elements in the context of strategic competition with China. Right? Next. This is actually the meat of my conversation, so if you guys want to have conversations about this is where you guys should speak up. Like part of the issue in acknowledging that we've got a real tangible dependence on China for these materials also implies that we should be trying to figure out, right, like where else we can get these materials, where else we can do the processing, where else we can you know, support industry as they think about metallization and scaling, right? We have seen in the past, and we've got kind of people in the room and online that have a lot of familiarity with alternative sources. They tend not to be in like most politically stable places all the time, right? And so like DRC, Zimbabwe, Turkey, like, I mean, yeah, we talk to these people, right? But it is figuring out Russia, like, you know, if you want to get off of Chinese dependence, do you think going to Russian dependence is going to be better? It's not going to be better, especially in the context of Ukraine. And there's a whole discussion right now about, again, kind of Russia, critical minerals, REOs, and the Ukraine situation and what's happening. Actually, there's someone in the room who actually has been to the mine in Congo, right? Like, and has actually seen that. The bottom line is every one of these mines and every one of the countries both have differences in the minerals that are available, the capacity to extract them, and then the broader political considerations about how to be able to promote their industry and promote access to the rest of the world, right? And so it becomes a complicated question. It is one that I know Congress has also looked at, most notably in the context of Australia and Canada and the Four Eyes designation as being part of DPA. There was an amendment last year on the floor that was offered to expand that. It ultimately didn't make it through Congress. We can talk about some of that if you want. It's kind of fascinating. You know, if and when we want to acknowledge, right, that mines and the raw material and the ore may come from different countries and territories and things like this, you know, there's still a significant part of that value chain and proposition that needs to happen after the mining, and that's, again, the hydrometallurgical operations, the separation, the metallization, and the production. Question is, if the ore is in a weird place, how can we leverage other friends, allies, like-minded partners to invest in and to help us on the rest of the value proposition, right? On the separation, on the processing. And this will, again, kind of interestingly tie into, you know, where you want to go for DPA activity, for CHIPS Act activity, for all of that kind of thing. Because what you'll end up finding is, again, there's probably a value proposition in having the government support places where they have an understanding of the providence of everything from ore to separation and all the way up, or, you know, where are the stop gaps in that, where you want to be injecting more incentives to be able to get people to start thinking about investments in different parts of that process. And so, again, I'll talk a little bit about that, but quite frankly, Al, Eric, and Desdi, Lima, it's a lot of names. I love Halima, but Halima, Najib Law, Desdi. I'm just gonna call her Halima. But when she gets here, I'll try to call her Desdi. It's a mouthful. But she'll talk about this. And so, you know, again, breaking up the process and the investments in where you are upstream versus midstream and downstream and what that looks like. The mineral security project people have called, Jenny Ellen just kind of put this out there, but and we can talk about it. It's kind of fascinating. They're trying to call it like the NATO for minerals. It's a relatively new concept. We'll see how it goes. It is primarily focused on kind of mid and downstream activities. Japan and ROC would love to see the Japan and Republic of Korea do more on this. I anticipate geopolitics between both Japan and Korea prevent a tremendous amount of cooperation there, as well as ongoing challenges with geopolitics as they are right now. And again, this last point is, again, just talking about, you know, where in the supply chain you want to go. Again, supply chain is a term that I think is kind of just thrown around, especially in this context, but there are different supply chains and different ways of addressing the risk in the different kinds of supply chains that you're looking for. Critical minerals and REs tend to be one of the more challenging supply chains to go down, especially because we do know that there is such a market share coming out of China, and then figuring out how far back most supply chain security offerings, products, capabilities end up going to like first and secondary considerations. Getting like third and fourth supply chain provenance is really challenging, especially on these. Next. Again, there you go, supply chain security. 2 out of the 3, like I said, of the metrics that were used to determine the 2022 list were directly related to supply chain, but there was no further definition of what they were actually looking for. What they said was, again, single point of failure in the supply chain and vulnerable to disruption from international considerations. Again, there's a lot of room for interpretation there. And clearly this is a place where China's market dominance, both in kind of the raw material, but also pretty far up that value chain, are tangibly felt. And so even with kind of significant investment in these multinational alliances, you know, at the end of the day, new mines, and you know, Eric can talk about this ad nauseum. He's lived and breathed these battle stars. Like, it is, new mines are not easy, right? They are not like a 1 to 2 year planning cycle. They are not, quite frankly, within a FIDIP planning cycle. FIDIP planning cycle is like 5 years. New mines take more than a FIDIP. I will tell you, the Defense Department is not particularly good at planning multiple FIDIPs, right? and we can talk about this, but there is clearly a need for a whole of government perspective and for government injection and industrial-based policy to be able to support this if this is indeed critical to our economy and national security. Excellent. I guess I'm not gonna take a breather here because I've only talked for like 15 minutes, right? I thought you guys would have more questions. Al told me if you guys didn't have more questions, I was failing, and I don't want to fail in front of Al because he's actually.
I have a
Yeah,
question.
go ahead.
So, excellent presentation. And I think what you're emphasizing is that this is really complex and there's multiple pieces to it. I really like the point about using our partners like the Australians. I think we should be leveraging what the Australians are doing, like they're negotiating a deal right now with the conflict, right? Now let's get behind that, right? We don't have to be upfront all the time. The other thing is, I think, looking at the complete picture, not only like refining, separation, mining, supply chain. Supply chain is just one piece of the whole picture, and then finding out where those disruptive points are and play within that space, right? But in order to do that, you need to have at least an idea of what we're dealing with. Using partners, 65% of cobalt comes from Congo. Again, I know Africa very well, but okay, maybe we don't do refining and separation, which is going to take 5 years from now. Do it in Zambia then, right? Do it in a more friendly country. Set up those universities and labs in these countries in order to allow for that transition to occur, and then actually take a real realistic picture. Like you said, the mining industry, we told the mining industry, hey, we don't want you to mine anymore, right? So I think it's about 7 to 10 years to get a mine up and running, and it's really hard to do. The ESG community hasn't helped because the whole green strategy relies on a rock coming out of the ground. That's another, narrative that needs to be communicated out. So saying all of these things is excellent, but it's really complex, and there's not just one piece. I think is what needs to be emphasized when we're talking rare earth. And now where we are at, if we start today, we are 5 to 7 years out from any type of solution. If we start today, and the Chinese have got 98% of the refining and separation capability. So I have a solution for that, but we'll get to that later. But yeah, I just wanted to make those comments that I think it's really complex, multiple pieces of it, something one.
But yeah, just a question, given your African expertise, it seems like a big part of the problem is governments in these countries, while they want theory, minerals to come out of the ground and create jobs, you're talking about something very loaded, how the wealth is going to be shared with the mining company. And that's not, that's not easy, even if everybody's lined up. And we've looked at mineral resources in a bunch of African countries.
Yeah.
The thought, because a company in Sierra Leone that
I would argue that to keep using that, it's too hard, right? Keep saying it's too hard and keep pushing that down, we don't want to deal with that. We don't want to go and work in these countries.
Who's demonstrating it? Yeah, that's the question. Without being Glencore.
Well, the last American mining company in Congo was 2015. I mean, that sold to the Chinese.
Right.
I mean, I agree with you in that there's complexities in pushing countries. I think now the African countries are actually willing to look at some of their own best practices, because I think they need the US are a little bit tired of coming. Another form of policy. So I think that, but DOD, State Department don't talk to each other. They're kind of on different paths. You have industry that's on a different, there needs to be.
Yeah, no, and I don't think there's any role models. That's part of the problem. Can't look at
The role
another
model
country.
that's been established has been China going into many of these countries with the Belt and Road Initiative.
But I would argue though, if you read what we did in Congo during World War II with uranium, how we pulled uranium out for the Manhattan Project. So we set up a system through the OSS to set up diamond traders that acted like they were diamond traders for taking uranium out because we didn't want the Germans to know what we were doing. So we have been doing, as a country, doing this in Africa for quite some time. It's just that we need, I think.
I don't think that's gonna work today.
Better,
but-
well, but I think we need to get more creative in our approach. I think it needs to come.
Yeah.
You said you had a solution. What is it?
Oh, a solution for, it's really a three-part solution. So the first one would be to build a stockpile and just buy any and everything from wherever you can get it and stockpile, what rare earths and critical minerals we need and then store it here in the United States.
Okay.
That would give us time. That would give us about 3 to 5 years, because I think we're down to like 4% of our stockpile. That would give us time to be able to develop either refining and separation in one of our friendly countries or develop new technology to do it here in the United States. And then finally, I think, 7 to 10 years from now, I am an optimist that we will have new types of technology to be able to do this successfully, and that's environmentally friendly. But that'd be 10 years from now. The first step is building a stockpile.
That's actually not bad. You hit three of my 4 conclusions.
Oh, okay.
We do have a question in the chat from Rebecca, with NDIA ETI. She said a couple charts back, you talked about the amount of REE required for certain defense systems. It seems like a large amount, but can you speak to how it compares to commercial applications? Essentially, how does defense demand of REEs compare to commercial demand?
I think Eric's gonna talk about this.
I'll talk about it later, but it's small compared to the commercial demand. Significantly smaller than the commercial demand. In which means you have to have companies that are investing in the space for commercial reasons that also are supported by defense applications rather than the inverse.
But it does depend upon which of the REEs that you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm specifically talking about the 4 major magnet metals. Those are going to drive the economics for any decision made by industry largely, and then support from the government for the ones that are not those 4 magnet metals.
When you go to gallium, for instance, in the very high power, high temperature, high power density semiconductors, it's not really a commercial application.
Correct. Agreed.
So that's what makes this so hard. Taking 50 minerals and trying to do a blanket statement, all of it.
Yeah, I guess I'm specifically talking about the rare earth side. The rare earth side itself, you have to have a commercial source of revenue to support the project. Defense is also needed, but
All right, we're gonna step through kind of what we're doing about it in the next kind of 10-15 minutes. I think this is actually the most interesting part because I am on top of being a space nerd of policy. Always. Here we go. What are we doing about it? The first thing to say is that this is being addressed in a whole of government perspective, which is to say that it is being addressed by and led by the White House, but there's significant action in Commerce, Interior, State, and DoD. And I come from a DoD and IC perspective, but this is particularly an area where those other agencies matter. So the White House has a tremendous amount of discretion to promulgate executive orders and executive action, right? Presidential determinations are basically the first step in the DPA Title III process that Jasny Halima will talk about. They are also the first step of the process for kind of any of the designations that end up going into the broader DPA considerations outside of the just strictly the Defense Department as well. There have been several executive orders over the past few years about critical minerals and REEs and supply chain, and you see these kind of policy narratives woven together. And so that's kind of interesting to see. They're the most aggressive ones clearly being about domestic supply chain and reducing all reliance on foreign supplies for and foreign adversaries for domestic mining and processing. This is just a sample of the presidential determinations and executive orders that have been promulgated by multiple administrations on rare earth elements. I will tell you that the ones that are the most recent and like kind of the America supply chain are typically associated also with the CHIPS Act and the Energy Act, and end up having a very strong emphasis on clean energy transition and the REs associated with that. USTR as an agency responsible directly to the White House also are the people that go into WTO and have successfully won actions through WTO where they have rightly pointed out China's price manipulation, gouging, and export manipulation, specifically on side. Interior. So we started this conversation about USGS's list of critical minerals and what that process looks like. Again, USGS is part of Interior. And so they actually have a tremendous amount of information both on the designation, the process, the metrics that they use, but also the land surveys of what's going on. And they have a really comprehensive report that they put out about critical minerals, their sources, how much of it is being used, the imports and exports. They are a very scientifically driven organization, which is also to state both, just imply and state that they are not a partisan institute or organization. Their stuff is very well regarded and gets very technically deep if you're into looking. And what they will do is they actually break out by each one of the critical minerals, kind of imports, exports, sourcing. It's a great wealth of information.
Geologic reserves and resources, how do they get their data? Do they send their own geologists out to Zambia, or are they relying on satellite? Do you know where they're, because they're global, right? Their approach is global, but do you know how they get their data from China, for example?
So I'm not familiar with like the deep methodology that USGS uses to source a lot of that data. I do know that they use multiple sources to do it. So they do have a core of people that go out and actually like boots on ground kind of do stuff. They also relies a lot on both overhead data, which is to say satellites, and a bunch of kind of intergovernmental relationships that they have with either other organizations or countries.
And just the USGS, the last, they were in Africa 2016. That they are using like NSAR and SAR data right now for.
You look like you had a question. Do you have a question? No, anybody? No? Okay, you're good. It's all good. Next. DOE is doing a whole bunch of stuff. Kind of interesting. so they recently put out a whole big report about what they're doing to support RAE and critical mineral stuff. It's, in the scheme of things, relatively small numbers. But it is also very much tied to clean energy transition, magnets, and in that they are trying to strike a balance, I think, between this clean energy transition and environmental remediation, which is another whole part of DOE. On any given day. And so what they are doing is funding a bunch of development projects and helping with kind of the, you know, the bipartisan infrastructure law to be able to fund projects that will be looking for cleaner energy ways of extracting and separating as well. I mean, their report online on this is like 150 pages of well-intended good stuff. We will see how they execute it. For me, and this is going to be something that we talk about in the context of commerce as well, having a huge drop of money just like drop into your lap when you have very little infrastructure to like actually assess that and then implement that is sometimes a challenge. DOE has this on a smaller scale for this kind of a thing. We'll see how it goes. But there's a lot of great information out there. They are very excited about the possibility that that the action on critical minerals and clean energy transition has brought to them. Next slide. Commerce, again, commerce. I think what commerce has recognized is that in adopting and being responsible for the execution of chips and semiconductor kind of action coming out of the Hill, they really got to figure out like what they're actually doing with all of that money. They were very late to the game in receiving that money and then having kind of the infrastructure back end to be able to figure out how to do that. So what you'll see is like, quite frankly, like the DPA Title III process can be long and laborious, but it's pretty much there. Like the process is there. Like people understand what the process is. Does the process work perfectly? No process works perfectly. But at least there's a process there. Chips and commerce, and I think Potomac Institute has done a course on chips previously. Chips implementation is a lot more fluid, dynamic, and changing by like the day. So they have a website set up. They have just announced kind of their first, basically FOA, their first kind of funding opportunity. They are still kind of going through and refining that. They are getting a lot of feedback from people, specifically on kind of the trusted foundries about whether or not they will be able to use CHIPS money, and CMRC is having challenges. So it'll be interesting to see, but a lot of the RE stuff for commerce is seen through that lens of CHIPS Act. Am I wrong? Good, all right. Next. State, I think Selena mentioned state. Again, state has a really important role in this because it is not enough to say that the US will do this on our own. We clearly do not have either all of the raw material to be able to do that, or throughout the value proposition chain down the line. Quite frankly, this is an area where we should be leveraging, I mean, this is Sarah's opinion, we should be leveraging friends and allies. I also think that in this kind of, when dealing with critical minerals and rare earths, this is a sector that benefits not just from Four Eyes community. So again, the DoD very, very heavy on our Four Eyes community, which is Australia, Canada, in the UK. I think a lot of refinement separation, a lot of that value proposition is also able to be done in countries outside of that Four Eye community, whether they're whether it's Finland, whether it's Japan. I mean, clearly the ones that are here in the Mineral Security Partnership are kind of outside of that 4i community as well. Sweden, I mean, this is, an area that I think is so complex because of the domestic national perspectives and regulatory regimes on this, that international cooperation needs to happen in this, and it will be fascinating to see the like-minded countries come together and be able to work through this or not, right? Again, State Department also having a significant role, or at least hyping themselves as having a significant role in CHIPS Act implementation. We'll see how that goes. They have in their documentation stated that they are looking to diversify downstream capacity, specifically in Indo-PACOM, which makes sense in the Americas. So think, again, Peru, Brazil, Chile, Argentina. And then they are responsible again for bringing kind of critical minerals and REs to the table, where the agendas for a lot of the, what are called the 2+2s, the defense ministerials, and the Department of State, or the ministers of that do kind of international cooperation with other countries. So you will see like Osmond just happened. So the Osmond is the big 2+2, right, for Australia and the United States. You'll see the Defense Department is or the State Department is responsible for setting those agendas, for driving action there. All right, next, DoD. This is my last one on this one. DoD again, DPA, T3. I mean, Al used to actually be responsible for this. We're going to have Kalima come in and talk about this. So I'm not going to go through this in a tremendous amount of detail because we've got experts, other experts actually responsible for this. Bottom line is DPA was started in 1950, has been used for everything from like baby formula shortages, right, to like respirators for COVID-19, is also used for like hypersonic stuff, right? Critical minerals, right? And there is a process that goes through because again, not all components and subcomponents are the same. Not all critical minerals are the same. They are prioritized for defense needs differently. Figuring out the methodology and the process for that is challenging, but is quite frankly pretty well established and is out there for people to see. It's pretty transparent. Again, I think Selena brought up stockpile. There is a DLA National Defense stockpile. I think there might actually be people in this course in the room or otherwise online who've actually worked with or for the National Defense stockpile. It is fascinating. It is also received a lot of attention from the Hill. The authorizers, who's by the way is an authorizer, our numbers don't matter, but the authorizers have basically like doubled and tripled the national stockpile kind of authorization over the past couple of NDAAs. We'll see how that goes. It's getting a lot of attention right now as well, but it is again another kind of area of responsibility for the DoD to maintain that stockpile, not only of critical minerals and REs for defense purposes. There's also, other things outside of just critical minerals that they do stockpile for broader defense needs. And there is an ability to sell and manage, right, how much we have in that stockpile in that process. There's been legislative action in the past couple of years talking about specific minerals that should be included in that stockpile. And that's kind of interesting to follow for people in industry and that have economic kind of incentive to do so. Next slide. Legislative, I think this is my last slide. I mean, look, at the end of the day, because this is a whole of government issue, because the issue set is so complex, it cuts across multiple committees across both the House and the Senate, which means that it is super painful. Because as a staffer, if Varun was here, he would be able to back me up on this. Halima can back me up on this as well. The most painful challenges you have as a staffer working on the Hill are never with the people of the opposite party or the opposing party. It's the most painful issues you have are with the people of the same party in a different committee of jurisdiction who want to do your job, right? And that's what you have here, is you have at least 4 to 5 different committees, both on the House and on the Senate, who all believe that they have jurisdiction over fixing this problem. Of that, you only basically have 2 or 3 must-pass bills every year that will have riders about this. The NDAA being one out of the armed services, right? House Armed Services, Senate Armed Services, approach bills, which don't carry a lot of policy, but their numbers actually matter. So those are important. And kind of debt ceiling things that have nothing actually to do with critical minerals, but will have several riders on them that may include things about critical minerals. I will tell you, this Congress is very interested in critical minerals, energy and water on the House side has renamed one of their subcommittees to include critical minerals because they're just, it's not energy and water, it's energy and commerce on the House side. In natural resources clearly has like a big say here, and they always roll in deep on the NDA and have kind of jurisdiction. They get jurisdiction over a bunch of those provisions as well. And so this ends up being an issue that if you're following from a policy perspective, a legislative perspective, I mean, I worked on House Armed Services, and so I'm always hyping House Armed Services being relevant. I will tell you there's, you've got to look at multiple committees. You've got to be touching the other committees as well, because they have a say, not only in the must-pass bills, but in their own standing legislation. And in the past, probably 3 to 4 years, standing legislation that has passed, that has real impact on critical minerals and REs have come out of committees other than just the armed services. I think that's it. I think I'm also relatively, oh man, here we go. So look, the rest of the day is going to be spent with people that are smarter, better looking, and all around better people than I am. I'm gonna queue up Al. Al has like his biography, if you haven't seen it, is at least a page. By the way, we shortened this, but it is terribly impressive.
You must have gotten an old one, because I've shortened it way down. I just say this.
So I will let him introduce himself after the break, and then he will be going through a deeper dive on the defense programs and requirements that are driving the need for critical minerals and RAEs. And then after that, we'll have Eric go, and then after that, we'll have Desdi, it's too much of a
Halima
Najib Locke come and do the capstone for us. So that's it. I will be here for the rest of the day, so just reach out and slap me if you got a question, but you are in very capable hands with the rest of the faculty as well. I would recommend we take maybe a five-minute break here to reset everything, and we can switch spots and to further caffeine.
And just so you know, there is a feedback loop as well. So for those of you online, this is on Canvas as well. Scan it and go ahead and work on that. And you guys here, it's up there, or I have a paper copy if you feel like you want to be in school, we can do like a test. So that's here as well for some feedback.
There you go. Do you want Ellen to sit over here?
Sure.
Or- yeah. That's like the most talking I've done.
Yeah, is that? Is that the right? Okay.
Yes.
No. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Okay, yeah, we both.
Maybe. Just like, yes, I didn't know.
Okay.
That's what it is. Okay, cool. Okay, great.
Yes.
I didn't actually live in.
Well, we don't
Yeah, by
have.
that point, I.
That's the question.
So
Yeah,
we're
the
so.
question
No, but you're right. Yeah. I was gonna say, that could,
Yeah. But it's funny because like I was doing that.
well, I said.
Yeah. Pass me up, best thing to do.
Yeah. So funny.
So that
Yeah,
would leave space for what? Right, that's.
Yeah, yeah. So where's the budget? Where's this in that?
It's Jen requested.
People.
Exactly. There's a real like virtual.
About like investing in training. So.
What? You probably have.
We're actually doing services. It's kind of an irony. So it's. Oh, like. Yeah, so it's like, just kind of scratch the surface.
Goes. And she did not want to go. She had a solid 10 pounds on. Not too far, I live right.
Yeah.
Which is absolutely.
How you like that?
Very, very.
Kind of like. We have. We have a couple. Specifically to. It's nice to like. I'm gonna see. Goes on with this. Yeah, this could work, but you get, you know.
Everybody's. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I'll sit there.
Yeah, I mean, I think. Every one of those.
I will probably not take. Think so.
Mostly on the west coast. We're around, yeah. Very nice.
The other place that.
Yeah.
Is.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. It was responsible.
Yeah, I mean, it's like.
Yeah, it's all good.
That's sort of like really.
For your.
I'm ready to do something.
Where's the easiest? Well, I mean, Also next to smaller scale projects.
They're actually, yeah.
By the way, I didn't even like saving. You, you're a course.
Yeah, I got you there.
Not easy. It's everybody.
I know.
You talked to Drew Walter lately?
I have not talked to Drew for about a month.
Okay.
He's a good guy.
Yeah, he's the one.
Okay.
We are gonna go ahead and reconvene. And there is a question online too,
Great.
from Michael O'Derrick. They're currently engaged to establish a mining operation in this community.
Yeah.
Using middle sovereign. Oh, it's not, oh, do you foresee any issues that we are presently a domestic?
I don't know that being a domestic company has much bearing on it. It's really gonna be how do they get around all the environmental laws of Europe and the European Union. And that's just a challenge. That's a huge challenge. Because if people think America's green, you ought to live in Europe. But, you know, there are processes to go through. Am I beginning?
We are going to turn this over to the Honorable Al Schaefer.
So I always like to start these things off with understanding or trying to get an understanding of what you want to get out of the course. And I'll see if I can steer anything that way. So that's thing one. Thing two, if we go through this and we don't have dialogue and questions, I have failed miserably. There are probably people in the room who know more about this topic area, not about defense than I do, but more about critical minerals and rare earth elements. But and since she's not here to defend herself, I'm going to disagree a little bit with Sarah. I agree that it's a complex problem. You're from Congressional Research Service? So I pulled something down yesterday. It is an updated 30 March 2023 from the CRS. When do you think the first legislation for critical minerals appeared in the DoD bill? Anybody want to make a guess? The first DoD bill was
2007. 2007.
You're only off by about 35 years. Well, 34. Critical minerals and rare earths were first mentioned in a National Defense Authorization Act in 1973, Public Law 92-570. We have spent the better part of 50 years admiring the problem. That's a term I used a lot in the Department of Defense. We're really good in government about admiring the problem. So when I have something like that, I go back to the font of one of the fonts of all wisdom. How many people remember Pogo? Okay, so there's one old person in the room.
Very old.
So Pogo was a comic strip back in the 70s and 80s. It's about a bunch of swamp creatures. And one of the most famous lines from that strip or any other comic strip is up here. We had met the enemy and he is us. Okay, in rare earths and critical minerals, we have met the enemy and it is us. We have spent the better part of 50 years, even though we don't have solid supply chains, even though we have a lot of regulatory things that prevent processing, we have spent the better part of 50 years getting in a worse and worse place with regard to critical minerals. I will also say I pulled off from the James Inhofe National Defense Authorization Act of 2023. We have yet another law. Every year we have a law in the NDAA. What is missing in the NDAA each year? It says don't use these things. What's missing? What happens if industry ignores it? There are no penalties written in these laws. If you don't have a penalty written in the law, what do people do? Ignore it. So we're really good about writing thou shalts and all that stuff, but we really haven't gotten to the place where we're fixing the problem. Now I'm going to go through and talk about some of the problem. I'm also going to talk about why this matters to defense. I love the commercial industry. You obviously work with the commercial industry, Eric, and I think the commercial industry is wonderful. But at the end of the day, we have just emerged from a period of, about 30 years where we did not have in the United States a near peer competitor. Okay, the Berlin Wall fell. To show you how long ago this was, I was a major, Air Force major on maneuvers with the Army about 20 clicks from the East German border the night the wall fell. That was kind of a tense night. We went from that to the peace dividend to the war on terror, always shifting our focus. So we've ended up in a very strange place where we have spent a lot of money on defense. We haven't spent a lot of money on getting things out quickly. And that's where the rare earth elements and critical minerals come in. Okay. I have slides on this later. We're going to get to the slides. But why do you think the Defense Department wants some of these rare earth elements and critical minerals? What does the Department of Defense get from them? Please.
Airplanes, missiles,
Everything.
Goes beyond that.
Well, they get access to a spectrum that a lot of people don't talk about. So they get access to being able to analyze things from space. And that's what, but I think some of the concern is that as Sarah touched on it, there's not a lot of understanding of what people might be talking about. So we kind of left some of that back when we were seriously in space, and that was with Bell Labs, and we were on top of the world. You know, we invented the transistor and took silica, and we've taken silica, you know, we've accelerated silica, solved all world problems, and then given it all away to other companies.
A good book to read, by the way, is Chip War.
Yeah.
Yes.
It gives us leverage, right? If we have a stockpile, or if we don't have a stockpile.
Right.
When we want to build those 12 aircraft carriers or 100 drones, and if we're relying on China, they're going to say, you know what? No, you're only going to build one of those aircraft carriers. I'm going to sell you enough. And they want to keep selling to us, but they'll limit how much. So we essentially lose our leverage to remain at the top.
So we have no leverage left. But I will go back to the first question.
True
I
statement.
posed. The reason the Department of Defense and national security instruments use these minerals and rare earths is because they provide a level of capability that you don't get from other things. You mentioned silica, and silica was really nice for radars back when we were in an analog era. Okay, built wonderful radars. What are the best radars now for the longest range, highest power, greatest, the fastest switching? Gallium nitride. So that the semiconductors are made out of gallium nitride. What's that gallium thing? It's a rare earth element. And it's actually one of those rare earth elements that isn't everywhere. It's actually a fairly rare earth element. It also doesn't have much of a commercial market. A little bit in some of the higher end electronics, but you can get almost everything you need for commercial electronics from silicon. When you go to the higher performance that you need for certain defense applications, that's where you start to bring in these rare earth elements. And that's why it becomes so important. I'll go through a couple of examples, but I think I've been boring enough now in this first slide. But just remember, this problem is all about POGO. Remember what POGO was? We have met the enemy and he is us. Next slide. I like stealing cartoons. Most of the cartoons I steal come from The Economist. We have moved from largely an industrial mechanical era into an information technology era. A lot of information technologies, especially the higher end ones, rely on rare earth elements. Most of our higher end compute systems, believe it or not, are heavily dependent on magnets. As you get into defense systems, almost all of our advanced guidance systems rely on rare earth elements in the form of magnets, in the form of advanced IR seekers, in the form of radar, all of which have superior performance. So as we have moved into an era of information, I won't say dominance, but information competition. I love this cartoon because that's kind of where we are right now with regard to competition with China. People are worried about competition with China in the physical domain. I'm probably more worried about the competition with China in the information domain. As we think about integrated sensing and cyber, for instance, and that relies on a different level that we have. I will also say we've had a next slide. We have the next slide. Okay, perfect. So I will once again respectfully disagree with Sarah.
Love it.
I had to do that. So we just had in October a national security strategy. It was about 70 pages. I am showing you the 3 references to strategic minerals. We had about 80 references to climate. We had about 90 references to green economies. The president has not put critical minerals into his security strategy. He does have the executive orders. I will say the executive order he signed in February 2021 was actually a fairly strong executive order. But we have bits and pockets of people looking at critical minerals. But does anybody believe we have a coherent strategy? I do not. And there are things that should be done in a coherent strategy. Next slide. Another interesting aspect of the national security strategy, this has nothing to do with rare earth elements and critical minerals, except for the fact that this administration is putting a very strong emphasis on what I will call activist industrial policy. The CHIPS Act, CHIPS and Science Act of $250 billion, $50 billion for semiconductors, is a very activist industrial policy. So at least the White House is open to investing federal funds, if we can find them, into shoring up our industrial base. Now, of course, that's going to run up against the debt ceiling, and there's no telling how this year's going to end other than ugly. But I think it's very important.
That's a given.
So I will go off script for just a minute. This year feels to me very much like 2011. 2011 was the last time we had a very strong push on the national debt ceiling. In fact, there's actually a Wikipedia page about it. What came out of the debt ceiling crisis of 2011? Sequestration and the Budget Control Act. I see us on the same glide slope right now. And that's going to hurt in efforts like this, where we actually do have to spend some money to get us out of a non-competitive area. Sarah, do you disagree with that?
I don't disagree with that. I had a discussion with a staffer on the Hill a couple weeks ago. And they said the exact same thing, and they were like, oh, we're careening towards sequestration. And I was like, oh, can we not say that word? Can we just say like, it's gonna be a rough year and we're gonna have a long-term CR and like maybe a government shutdown or two. And she was like, oh no, sequestration.
So
And I was like, great.
inside baseball, I worked directly for Ash Carter, who was actually a very good boss at the time. One of the things I think that he made a mistake on, but this rippled through the administration. We were not allowed to plan for the event of sequestration. So we got about 3 days before it, and it became apparent it was going to happen. And we all said, oh crap, what do we do now? And that, friends, was an ugly summer. Enough of that. National Defense Strategy was put out about 3 weeks after the National Security Strategy. This is all I could find in a 40-page document that talked about prioritizing joint efforts for the full range of domestic and international partners in the defense ecosystem to fortify our defense industrial base, our logistics systems, and fortify relevant global supply chains. If you're smarter than I am and can parse that sentence into something that makes sense, we have a clear signal that we want to enhance the global supply chain, but the strategy was short on how to do it. Next slide. I hope you can see this slide. It's about 2 years old now, and it shows where the source of critical minerals are for a number of the different critical minerals. What do you notice is the overwhelming balance? I mean, this is largely an Asia-driven thing. Now, I will tell you that you can go to sources and get all kinds of different numbers as to who's producing what, where's it mined. At the end of the day, as of 2019, the USGS said China had about 61% of the mining capacity worldwide, but 85% of the rare earth oxides produced, so the processing. So the numbers are fairly consistent. China mines a lot, other people mine a lot. A lot of people send their minerals to China for processing refinement. Why aren't we getting involved in that game? I will give you a fact. For every ton of rare earth elements, this national USGS, about 2,000 tons of toxic waste are produced. I don't know about you, but if I'm on the ratio of one good thing for 2,000 bad things, I'm probably not going to go with the bad things. So what does that mean for defense? I'll get to it with my recommendations, but for defense, this means we have to find a way to get some of these materials without some of the ecological byproduct that we have now. I contend that there are ways, but we're not spending much money on clean processing of rare earth elements. If you look at that, I mean, Africa looks very promising. You talked about Africa. For things like cobalt, Africa is wonderful. For things like rare earths, to include gallium, to include germanium, to include indium, it's all China. And those are all parts of our high-end optical systems. So I think that this is an important chart to recognize where the sources are, but then also turn around, where's the production? So why do rare earths matter? I was astounded by this. For every JSF, Joint Strike Fighter, we use about 920 pounds of rare earth elements. Think about that. So a lot of magnets in the actuators, a lot of magnets in some of the couplings, but also most of the optical systems use rare earth elements. A single Virginia class submarine uses 9,200 pounds of rare earth elements. Okay, about 4.25 tons. That's a lot of material. A surface ship is about 4,700 pounds of rare earth elements. And I quoted this number before. Over 80%, maybe a little bit more of the rare earths come from China. What could possibly go wrong with that? If we are in a high-end fight or competition, and if we rely on rare earth elements for our most advanced fighter aircraft, our most advanced conventional submarine, our surface fleet, we are almost totally reliant on material that comes from China. Hence the need for a greater stockpile. Sarah talked about the stockpile a little bit. I don't think we go nearly far enough. And I don't think we've thought through what we need to have in it and how do you prioritize it. Any questions at this point? Yes, I love it, a question.
So to know like how much you need in the stockpile, like does DoD typically go down, like go to the component level of saying, okay, so I have a guidance, I have a radar, then I also have a modulator or like a phase shifter that relies on rare earths. Do they actually go down to that level to calculate how much each program needs to produce that whole system idea?
What do you suspect?
I haven't found anything, so I don't.
Okay, so I will answer that question in terms of microelectronics. So I spent a lot of time in microelectronics. The primes and the Department of Defense does not buy many microelectronics. What does the department buy? Comm systems, radars, optical systems, all of which are assembled by sub-tier providers. And we have not put in place the policy to gather up the parts list at a sub-tier level. So honestly, the Department of Defense right now does not have a handle on the parts that they use, microelectronic parts that they use. And that pervades almost everything. Now, we know when we have asked for a certain performance in a radar system, we have a pretty good handle that it's gallium nitride. We know that when we buy our radar systems for testing, because of the performance and characteristics, the department actually went out and bought 18 to 20 GAN radars, ground radars from a company in Australia. So we have a handle at that broad level, but at the lower level, not really. And the next slide, if you can see it, will show you how complex this is. Okay, so a typical Navy SEAL uses equipment. These are the subcategories of minerals that are in the 50 critical minerals that Sarah talked about. So we have critical minerals in the night vision devices, the goggles, in comm systems, in the weapon. So we basically have these critical minerals everywhere. Now, what choices does the department have? Okay, when you have systems that are built to rely on this, you basically have, in my opinion, three choices. One, say, I'm going to accept the lower level of performance. How often does that happen in the department? How often should it happen in the department? I don't think it should happen in the department. We're talking about people's lives here. So if you're talking about people's lives, then you either have to have an assured supply of these minerals, which right now we really don't have, or you find a replacement that operates the same capability set, the same performance level. But I mean, aluminum, germanium, arsenide, lanthanum. All of these are rare earths and minerals on Sarah's wonderful 50 chart. That's a lot of different types of minerals going into the equipment that we use. So for the DoD, the primary things that matter: size, weight, and performance. What do rare earths give you? Smaller form, fit, and function, for the most part lighter weight and greater capability. So these minerals provide those parameters that you need to be able to fight effectively. The downside to the minerals, we don't have an available supply chain, and they're going to cost me.
How do we get those minerals now? And China's selling to us, so what's their motivation other than
Money.
money?
It's not that much.
No, but if you think about it, if we get into increased tensions with China and they make a decision,
We're shut down.
we're shut down. Now, we have enough for some of these things that we would exist for a little while. But this problem is not unique to critical minerals and
So their
rare earths.
focus is higher on the profit margin than it is on the political margin at the moment. So we're on a scale.
So let me frame it up again in terms of microelectronics. About 70% of the microelectronics we use in the country are what are considered to be legacy chips, 45 nanometer and larger.
Right.
We don't have much production in the United States of those anymore. China has invested in 9 new factories in the last 2 years to focus at 28 and 45. For the commercial sector, we are going to be reliant on China. SMIC, Undersecretary Estevez, who had the job in the Pentagon before I did, has now put SMIC on the entity list, which means we're going to have a hard time importing. We got to find a solution very, very quickly. And the critical minerals are going to follow microelectronics in this space, but it's still part of the same thing. Where do you get the supply when the supply is controlled by someone who has adversarial behaviors against you?
So now in the supply chain, the people that are holding this are Chinese companies in general that are selling to us. So that from the single ruler dominance, they could be shut down right away.
Effectively,
It's not,
Eric, you work in this space.
They've already put an export ban on technology.
Right.
This is downstream, so the technology side would be wire cutting. That's just a shot across the bow. They did this in 2010, the price spiked when there was a big investment in new mines to backfill the supply. They brought new supply on, released the export ban, the prices collapsed.
The government has export licenses, so they can grant or not grant people.
Yes.
So you decide not to have an export license, then all of a sudden material can't get on the country. They were really good and easy to use control. It's not like they got to call a bunch of companies. They just say, we're auctioning fewer export licenses.
Xi Jinping is reported to own double-digit percentages of most of these companies.
So we're a phone call away.
In essence, I mean, we do have some
Yeah, I
stockpile,
mean, but
but we do not control a critical asset that we need for performance of our defense systems. And that is not a comfortable place to be. Yes,
I would go back to your first. Yeah,
Yeah.
so they, our worst enemy, right? The Chinese know us better than we know ourselves. And in this case, the Chinese don't want us on a war footing when we were just talking about this, when we're at our best, right? When we will develop the technology and create factories and, but we're fat and happy right now. While we're getting our big screen TVs and, no one's really looking at these slides, right? The Chinese want to keep selling to us and essentially
Right.
need us, right, as a market. But until we push back, get into that war footing, nothing's really going to change, and we're at their mercy. But they know us better than we know ourselves.
Yeah. So the thing that I worry about, I'm going to take a quick poll of the room. Are relations between the US and China better today or better in 2020?
Worse today.
Worse today. A
it's
lot
better,
worse
better.
today. A lot worse today. Where both sides are doing things to ratchet up the heat. I'm not going to say that China's all at fault in this. I mean, we're doing some pretty aggressive behaviors ourselves. But each one's a step up the ladder. And how do we respond if they say, we're not going to sell minerals and rare earth elements to you. We're going to go to our new best friends and partners in the Middle East. Oh, by the way, have you noticed that China is entering into strategic alignment with Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq? We're going to go to our new best friends in Africa. They will find a market. They'll trade Russian petroleum for Chinese materials and minerals. And at that point, it becomes much harder for the West to get access to the materials they need and to get access to the materials needed for sustainment of existing platforms. So, and frankly, I think that the government does a really nice job talking in this hyperbole and not really getting out right to the part of the matter with Jane and Joe Sixpack from some farm in Iowa. You think they understand this whole business of rare earth elements and materials and minerals? No. We haven't explained it to them. So we have not built up, in my opinion, consensus within America that we have a problem. We kind of implicitly know it here in the Beltway because that's where we live. And when you look at the facts and figures, it's pretty significant. So the next slide. I will give $1 to the first person who can read the third line down. Oh no, wrong one, wrong order. Oh, there we go, yeah. So I put this slide in here not because I'm going to look at it or read it or anything like that. We're going to break it down a little bit later. But I put it in because Sarah referenced the list of 50 critical minerals. The reference to this graphic is on the slide. If you're interested in this space, it's a good graphic to have because it shows the 50 critical minerals, but it also shows the net import to the United States and by inference, partners and allies of each one of these. Once you get down past about the sixth or seventh mineral, we are over 50% reliant on imports. That's kind of significant. Yes,
Back to your point about, you know, the narrative right out to the people of the United States, right? So what do you think is, as I say, what's their love language? What do you think is gonna get them where they're like, oh my God. Right? Do you think it is, and it's a question.
you know, I understand it. I think I think we have to be honest that some of our high-end capabilities that allow us to have a positive or a deterrent force rely on some of these minerals. You know, one of the only real jobs of government is to protect its people. And if you put it in that terminology, I think people understand that. We need access in the Department of Defense, and by the way, Homeland Security and other places, to these minerals to be able to provide an active deterrence against going to war. And if we can't sell that, we don't have much of a, you know, I mean, we're playing poker with about a 3, 4, 6, 7, and 9. And that's not a winning hand. So I will implore you folks to go out and help us make the message. Because as I say, we've been admiring the problem. And now it's time to sell the problem to the people.
I often say, is it when, you know, we can't go to Costco and buy a big screen for the Super Bowl, or is it when we, you know, phone becomes too expensive? Is it that where it becomes like an issue?
So I would look to Eric, who works in the commercial sector. I don't give the rear quarter of a rat about the big screen TVs.
Yeah, and I'm with you. I come out of DoD too, so
Yeah.
I see the urgency, but I'm just wondering.
But as far as selling it, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But again, this is something that I want to see a coherent national strategy and a coherent national message about why this is important. Okay, and to date, you're seeing pockets. There's some very nice work done by the Congressional Reference Service. Have you done any of those reports?
Not these, but just to that point, I think there are some similarities. Chip shortage for vehicles is largely due to lack of transparency between this original equipment manufacturer and where the chips come from. So the problem is the same with DoD in terms of transparency down to levels where it's important to get the superior technology. But even for the legacy chips, that's also a similar problem amongst both DoD and automotive industry, and both of them have such a minor market share of the overall chip industry.
Although I contend that one of the reasons the CHIPS Act passed was the global supply chain crunch on microelectronics to the auto industry. I mean, that cost the worldwide auto industry something like $200 billion in 2021 and 2022 because we didn't have microelectronics, and that made it easier to sell.
Yeah, in your Suburban, you couldn't get, you wouldn't have the board that would give you the better gas mileage. In the Suburban, that's really a problem, and gas was high.
And you couldn't, well, yeah, but you couldn't even get a Suburban.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
But didn't the Air Force wake up to the microelectronic issue about 5 or 6 years ago? So what, now, I think there was a discovery that the F-16 had a bunch of microelectronic parts in it coming from China, and this probably goes back to 2016, 2017. What did the Air Force do about it then?
Accepted the risk.
That's what happened. That's what came out. Just said, okay.
Same as rare earths, probably, right?
You accept the risk. This is all risk management, and as tensions ratchet up, then the risk becomes higher. And that's kind of the glide slope we're on right now, which is, oh, please.
I see your hand is up.
Hey, sorry, this is Eric. I work with OSI, Air Force Office of Special Investigations, as a counterintelligence analyst stationed over at the LA Air Force Base. Over the past several years, myself and some of the OGAs have done lots of engagements with industry. And a few years ago, probably 3 or 4 years ago, Odie and I led an initiative up in the Silicon Valley to brief probably about 30 to 40 C-suite executives, those that are significantly involved in the microelectronics industry. These C-suites came into the meeting not cleared, so they signed an NDA, and Odie and I read them on for about 2 hours. Following those discussions, many of those C-suites canceled ongoing contracts that they had overseas with tier 1 adversaries, or at least ones that we now define as tier 1 adversaries. I would recommend something of the sort occur as well within if there's a consortium of rare earth element industry experts and personnel, both at the commercial and defense industrial base. Such a briefing may help communicate the message across a monetary impact to their investments, which is at least what occurred in the question that you asked: how did the Air Force address microelectronics issues? Some of that affected the national industrial base efforts within the microelectronics consortiums. So again, just a recommendation on looping in Odie and I, see if they could leverage their ability to read on folks to sources and methods, which, as you can imagine, C-suites, they want numbers and figures and specifics to base a decision on, not just that China's bad out here.
So Eric, thank you. I'm not going to comment on that at all, but it's not a bad recommendation. Just leave it at that. Okay, next slide.
Understood, thanks.
So the USGS, and again, I have the reference down here, possibly put out the ugliest graphic I have seen in a government document. That's the graphic up here. But the graphic itself is very important because it conveys economic vulnerability of the 50 rare earths, the disruption potential, and the amount that we import into the United States. It's the size of the circle. And there is no way in hell that you'd be able to read these. Even when I had it up on the big screen on the yellow things, I couldn't read them. But the report actually goes into detail analytically how they made these assessments. So if you take a look at what we have, aluminum, very high economic vulnerability, and medium disruption vulnerability. By the way, I drew the red line there and just said anything north of the red line, bad. And it's purely subjective. Tungsten. Tungsten is absolutely vital to modern ground combat vehicles because it has some degree of tensile ability to withstand and dampen shock. That becomes pretty important when you're riding around a steel vehicle that otherwise could crack. Niobium and germanium and neodymium, all important for IR sensors and lasers. The same with, and I'm not even going to try it, praseodymium. Anybody can say that better than I can? I got $1 for you also.
Praseodymium.
Cobalt, gallium, lanthanum, these are all very critical minerals to the Department of Defense. And I'm going to go through why on each of those. But it's important to see where some of these minerals lie. And now from the U.S. Geologic Service, the economic vulnerability is really about commercial vulnerability, not defense vulnerability. But this, to me, is a very nice graphic representation of where we have problems. I showed you the chart a couple charts ago with the whole 50. So I've blown it up a little bit. And again, I'm not going to go through all of those. But as I've gone down and assessed each one of those critical minerals, if I have a red star next to them, it's important for defense applications. If I have two red stars next to it, it's critical for defense applications. And as you go through it, these are the first 13. These were arrayed. The ones on top were the part that we imported the least. So beryllium, we import about 11%, and we have a stockpile. So you can go through this chart very quickly and determine what we stockpile, how critical those minerals are to the Department of Defense, and how much we import. And if you notice, by the time you get down to number 5, germanium, 50% import. Fundamentally, on this chart, if you look at the minerals that are here, if we don't have access to these, our platform weights go up, our ability to withstand shock goes down, and near IR sensors go away. That's not a great thing for fighting. Okay. And in the interest of time, yeah, I won't go through the next ones. You'll have them in your package. But as you see, I've gone through, and each of these, I'm looking at the impact. For this group from 14 to 33, you lose fuel efficiency, you lose steel, you lose seekers, you lose IR chips, communications, and lasers. Does that matter to the Department of Defense? So I think that this is an important way to look at it. Flip to the next one, Lakeisha, and then we'll go on. Okay. So we've gone through and looked at all of those. Now I'm going into looking at optical devices. Within defense optical devices, what are the materials that are used? By the way, there's a quiz on this at the end of the day. One of the hardest things about these critical minerals is you got so much crap running around your head, you can't keep them straight. Unless you're smarter than I am. But if you look at this, optical devices, dependent on rare earth elements and critical minerals. Night vision devices, communication gear, lasers. Next slide. Magnets. By the way, one of the things a lot of people don't realize is how vital magnets are to advanced fighter aircraft. You don't have an advanced fighter aircraft without magnets. We want advanced fighter aircraft? Oh, and oh, by the way, just to make you feel at ease, the US has the F-22 Raptor and the F-35 JSF, 2 of the 5 fifth-generation airplanes that have flown. China has the J-20 and J-31. J-31 is not operational yet. But if you look back to what I just said, modern advanced aircraft rely on magnets and other rare earth elements. China has access and control over much of the rare earth elements. So then you do the ... What could possibly go wrong with that? Steel and steel alloys, pyrotechnics, and energy and batteries. I didn't include praseodymium, which is a vital component of high-end jet engines for fighters, because praseodymium operates very well in a very high temperature regime. So our jet engines for high-end aircraft rely on rare earth elements. Am I convincing you that these things are important to the DoD? I see two of 8 heads going up and down. You know, as you go through this, it really is kind of mind-boggling, because most people don't pay attention to lanthanum and strontium and tungsten and all of these different materials but they all have specific applications that give the DoD and our allies an advantage in combat. I can't speak for other people, but I really want to keep that advantage in combat. I think Colin Powell had it right. We don't want to have a fair fight. Okay. Next slide, we won't go over this one. But it's a nice background. It shows you where the source is of those minerals that are 100% net import to the United States. In the middle, I have highlighted how much of those come from China in red. It's kind of a whole bunch. That's a technical term. Skip the next one. I want to do a very brief case study and then end up with what I believe are solutions to the problem. So I talked a little bit about optical devices. And in fact, if you look at atmospheric transmission windows in the near IR, there's a really good transmission window of 1.06 microns. Most of you aren't physicists or meteorologists, so you won't remember that. But what that means is on either side of that unit, all the energy is absorbed. At 1.06, it goes through in the near IR. Does that matter? Next slide. I love this slide because you can see the difference in the same image of visual, shortwave IR 1.06, midwave and longwave IR. As the wavelengths get longer, your resolution gets to be much worse. In the optical, if you have anything between you and the target, you don't see it. In the shortwave IR, you still get some resolution. We prefer in the US to have many of our systems operate in the shortwave IR bands because you get the best combination of resolution and performance in the atmosphere. Now, take a look at the shortwave IR. What are our sensors? Germanium, indium gallium arsenide, indium gallium arsenide phosphide. And then you can kind of make an argument for zinc selenide, but that's out there much longer at the 3.5 wavelength. Everything we have that operates at that second window relies on rare earth elements. Does that matter? We're going to rely on IR sensors. That matters. And I think that may be the best takeaway of this whole thing. Why rare earths matter. Because you get the best mix of performance and capability. So I think that's kind of neat. Next one. One of the next big things is lasers and military lasers. Once again, once you start to go up the power curve, we can make the nice little green lasers that people use for pointers. Those aren't military systems. As you go up into higher performance, higher power systems, they almost all rely on rare earth elements. Are lasers going to be part of the battlefield kit of the future? Absolutely. So this again shows why that's important. Next, magnets and modern fighters. I've already talked about this, but between the neodymium and the cobalt samarium magnets, all rare earth elements. And the reason it's rare earth elements, the neodymium magnets are the strongest permanent magnet per weight anything in the world. They're a little costly, but they will give you a much better performance than anything else. So in order to save time, go through to slide 22. Really stretched this out, haven't I?
Which is it, this one here?
That one, yeah. So this all matters. And talking about availability, in September 2022, Lockheed discovered that they had Chinese sourced cobalt samarium magnets in the F-35 supply chain. That caused a shutdown in the F-35 for a while until the secretary and the undersecretary decided that they could live with the risk and did a waiver allowing these Chinese parts into the system. What happens if those parts go away? We have a permanent grounding of the F-35. This gets to be kind of serious. The reality is we have to find alternatives to what we currently have. I don't want to do that one. Go to 24. So as I've said, we have kind of admired the problem for way too long. And I'm as guilty as anybody. In 2019, I gave a speech in San Diego. I love going to San Diego because the Naval Communications West Conference, huge conference, 1,000 people. And I talked about the problem with rare earth elements primarily, but the same holds for critical minerals. I said we have to take 4 courses of action. The first is stockpile the critical national needs. And we're starting to think about that now, but I would prioritize defense. Second, critical national infrastructure, meaning power grid, FAA, air traffic control network. And then finally, economic well-being. And I think this has to be a whole of government thing. Second, we have to use Defense Production Act to enhance domestic production. Halima will be in to talk about that. We've had a couple of presidential determinations. We need money appropriated. So it's one thing to have authorization. It's another to have appropriation. And this has nothing to do with materials and minerals, but I find it fascinating. Last year in the National Defense Authorization Act, the authorizers authorized $3 billion worth of equipment to be sold to Taiwan. How much money is in the budget for it? 0. Appropriators didn't follow. So you got to get both sides working together. The authorizers and appropriators have to work in tandem. And if Defense Production Act and rare earths are a problem, we have to have money appropriated to get some of those our production chains enhanced.
Is this where sequestration is really going to bite? Is just the cross the line cut won't allow for the appropriations to happen even strategic when.
So I'm most worried about a year-long continuing resolution or sequestration. So right now, the hard right wing of the House is demanding we bring domestic discretionary spending back to 22 levels. That is $130 billion out of the budget. Defense is half of the discretionary budget. To date, the House has said, we don't want you to touch defense. My fear is we're going to end up with a deal at the end because the president can't take $130 billion out of non-defense discretionary. So we end up with half defense discretionary, half non-defense discretionary, an 8% cut in the DoD budget. If that happens, someone's going to have to make really hard choices. And things like rare earth elements might get deferred unless we make a very strong case. We have seen this before. And I will do another excursion away from rare earth elements, but I'm doing this for Sarah. So right now, we have a $1.2 trillion effort in the Defense Department to modernize the nuclear triad. How'd we get there? Well, we were first supposed to modernize it with the systems that were expiring in the early 90s. Cold War ended, the Berlin Wall came down, we threw the football down in the end zone and said, great, we can defer this for 10 years. And 9/11 happened, the focus shifted to counterinsurgency. And now we have a problem that the Minuteman III that was supposed to last for 10 to 15 years is, about 35 to 40 years old. The Columbia class, when it comes online for a nuclear submarine, will replace the first of the Ohio class current nuclear submarines. When the Ohio class comes out, that will be the oldest serving submarine in the Navy ever. So we get here by trying to defer problems, and we end up at a place where the answer is untenable. I can't make the decision for Congress and other folks. I think that we're getting close to an untenable position. We're maintaining the critical minerals and materials we need for defense capabilities. And we just have to make that case. The third thing I said we should do is research how to process rare earth elements, critical minerals, without ecological Armageddon. I like that phrase, don't you? Ecological Armageddon. 1 ton of rare earth, 2,000 tons of toxic waste. We've got to flip that equation. And then finally, research how to provide rare earth critical mineral performance without having to use those particular materials and minerals. So that was my fourth prong of the strategy. You hit 3 of them very, very well. But this is how I go back to, we've been admiring the problem. It's a team effort, yeah. Sarah talked about the executive order for 14017, which required a 100-day report. There was a whole of government report. Commerce did microelectronics. The DoD did rare earth elements. In June 2021, next slide. This was the recommendation of the Department of Defense on how to deal with critical materials and rare earth elements. Looks kind of like my 4, doesn't it? This is not rocket science and alchemy.
Literally.
Huh?
Literally it is, but.
Well, that's true. But, I mean, so we have understood the solutions. We just haven't pulled the trigger. That's kind of how we got to where we got to, was something that's very, very important for the DoD. Next slide. Commerce also did a review of rare earth elements. Does it look familiar? Recommendations? So how many times do we have to have the same recommendations? And I'm going to leave you with 2 charts that have almost nothing to do with critical minerals and rare earth elements. You probably can't see this, but I'm showing this because I spent my life in defense technology development. In March this year, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute listed the 44 critical technology areas in their assessment in the world. These were based on top 10 cited research papers, and it was very analytic. What they found was 38 of the 44 areas, the technology leaders were the Chinese. So we have fallen behind in a number of areas. And if you look at it, it includes nanoscale materials and manufacturing, critical mineral extraction and processing, advanced magnets and superconductors, all led by the Chinese. So I will leave you with that happy thought. And we'll go to the what to take away slide. You can read those. I guess I'd say, what questions would you have, or what dialogue would you want?
So, I would. This is of, Ben. He doesn't want to use whole of government anymore, he uses whole of nation. Because he thinks we should be talking to financial institutions and economic side as being part of the solution. That they're gonna play a big role in making it happen. I think we're already seeing that with that DoD standing up the
Office of Strategic Competitive, yeah. Or capital, yeah.
Yeah, and and let's be honest, everyone thinks there's money going into that. There is some, but it's really a match, that they're expecting.
You said 25 or 100 million, I can't remember.
I've heard different amounts, and I don't even know if that's been funded yet.
100, okay. So it was 100. I didn't remember. There was one that was
The PBR was 100, we'll
AUKUS
see if it
25.
makes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
AUKUS was 25.
But
AUKUS-
then commercial has to money thing.
Yes, yeah.
So it has to make sense then, it has to.
So I think government and the American industry can equally claim and share this problem. I think I'd like to say a whole of nation because it will be a whole of nation solution. But at some point you have to have leadership. And I'm going to be brutally frank now, right? This is Chatham House rules. Right now, our industry is focused on stock buybacks and dividends. And that won't be the leadership that you need to solve this problem. I mean, I love capitalism. I think capitalism is marvelous. I have a couple of stocks. I love seeing stock dividends and buybacks. But at the end of the day, you can't put short-term profits ahead of a long-term solution. And that's why I think if the government doesn't take the leadership in this with industry, we're not going to solve it.
Could we do so SpaceX, Elon Musk, the Air Force funded his Starlink program. So is that a kind of model that we could maybe for this?
So yes and no. I mean, yeah, I think Starlink is terrific. And once Elon Musk is kind of like a drug dealer. He gives you a little taste and then he jacks the price up. So
I'm just using that as maybe.
no, I understand that, but my point is you've got to have some give and take, and it can't be purely profit driven.
Yeah, agreed.
And that's kind of where we're at right now. I love the idea of going out to folks like SpaceX who can go faster than government. We just have to figure out a long-term relationship of how that works for spending taxpayer money. I spent a lot of time in government, and I would always tell people, I worked for a couple in West Virginia who struggled to put food on the table. I worked for I come from Vermont. I worked for the woodchucks in Vermont who, 5th and 6th generation inbred. That's who you work for. And you have to be accountable for every dollar.
Yeah. Rebecca has some questions online.
Thanks so much. Al, thanks for a great presentation. This is fantastic. I just had a couple questions, if it's all right. I think the first one I probably know the answer to, but I'd like to get your thoughts. You talked about the need for an overall strategy. And obviously, when we're talking about critical minerals, you have the defense applications, you have commercial applications, there's a lot of agencies involved, a lot of different players involved. Are you saying that it needs to be something from the White House level, or is there a specific agency or department that you're looking for that strategy from? So that'd be question number one.
Yep.
And then question number two, I'd like to get your thoughts on sort of, there's been some efforts, especially on the DoD side, to get at some of these issues. So for instance, I know that they gave some money to Mountain Pass, a domestic rare earth miner, to set up some processing facilities, some kind of bits and pieces here and there to try and get at this problem. And I'm curious to get your thoughts of how those efforts are going, or if it's too early to tell if they're going to be successful.
Sure. So Rebecca, for the first one, I would love to see a consortium of the right government agencies with industry invited. However, those typically don't self-organize. So I would make this the responsibility of either the National Economic Counselor or the National Security Counselor. Tell them that they have, from the White House, choose a number, 4 months or 6 months to come back in with the first look at the answer. But it's got to be driven, I believe, at a high enough level to make, hell, in a perfect world, you make this the responsibility of the vice president. But it's got to be at that level, I think, Rebecca, because otherwise people scurry to their own parochial interests, and we end up with the disjointed state we're in right now. A second one on Mountain Pass, too early to tell. I mean, the money just flowed a couple of years ago. And as we're getting more money flowing, we're getting way more environmental regulatory posturing. So I don't know if it's going to work or not. And we have to balance the regulatory environment with the ability to get stuff out of the ground and processed. And I think we won't know for a couple of years.
Yeah, Mountain Pass is mostly a bastnasite mine, so it's a light rare earth mine. Money, I think, was driven for heavy rare earths, which they have very little of. They're actually in the process of commissioning their hydrometallurgical operations right now. Just had dinner with their COO probably 3 weeks ago.
Is it going to work?
I think it will.
Good.
Yeah, I have faith that they will get over the line. It's going to take some time because this is the way they operated the mine before. They were after cerium. Now they're after different metals. So it's a complete redesign.
Good. So Rebecca, he had a much better answer than I did. Did that answer your question?
It did. Thank you so much.
You bet. Yes.
Follow on to the Mountain Pass. So say in the future, even though we do have the domestic capability, so how does defense industry compete with the commercial industry who have much more demand and they're willing to pay much more money, probably, securing these materials?
So it has always been my position that if the Defense Department truly needs something, they will pay the price to get it. And you see that in a lot of areas, not the least of which microelectronics. So I don't worry about the commercial defense balance. If I really need something, I'm going to go pay the price for it. You know, it's again, kind of like microelectronics. People pay an extra surcharge for secure microelectronics. It's not commercially viable, but the department pays for it because there's intrinsic value. If I need that stuff, I'm going to find a way to go pay for it. Do we have a silence falling over the room?
How, for these technology applications that you brought up, like for gallium nitride, if we were to stockpile and secure gallium, how about the gallium nitride chip manufacturing? Because that would be also highly capital intensive industry and hard to secure that domestically. And those are legacy nodes.
So there are two answers. One, when we needed a certain class of radar in the DoD, We found a manufacturer in Australia that could make it. And we use that. The second, I'm aware of at least 3 foundries in the US who have been moving into GaN for processing. So I think we'll be there. But again, this is going to have to be something, these companies didn't move into that for free. And they moved in because there was a higher profit margin. I tend to break things down to something simple. If we really need something, we'll pay for it. And we have paid for and subsidized small scale foundries. We had a semiconductor manufacturer in Minneapolis that the department paid $25 million a year, every year, to keep the line warm in case we needed radiation hardened chips. Some years we got nothing out of that. We had the line still in place.
Isn't that the real answer? Because you started at the beginning, you said that there's 3 criteria the military has, but the private sector doesn't have those criteria, right? So the private sector isn't going to be driven to set up a supply chain for radiation hardened microelectronics. You know, and just like in permanent magnets, you know, people are maybe willing to trade weight for performance, for you know, for magnets made from other materials. I mean, I think that's kind of and this private sector is so ingrained to drive costs out of their system. And they were trained over the last 20 years to build global supply chains, and there was nothing wrong with that. So I mean, I think there's a lot of retraining the private sector has to go through to get better aligned with it.
And the government sector, frankly. I mean, we have to co-evolve in this. But you're absolutely right.
And just to emphasize it's interesting, the priorities in terms of how important some of these mature nodes or some of these are, but how that's prioritized funding.
I've seen a lot of movement lately for CHIPS Act to at least carve out a portion for state of the president and legacy. And you know, frankly, legacy foundries are a lot less expensive. If I'm building a state of the art, it's $20 billion. If I'm building a 45 nano, you get 5 to 4 or 5 billion. So I think the key thing from my perspective is, are we balanced? If we hit it, well, I'm 4 minutes overtime. And we have hungry people here looking to say, can I have food? Folks, I've enjoyed this a great deal. I hope it's been useful for you. It's the perspective of someone who's been around for a long time. This is one of those really hard problems, along with nuclear modernization, along with a bunch of other things that we have to solve in order to still present credible deterrent. Frankly, for the young kids who go out to fight. I'm not going out and getting deployed anywhere again, but I will have nieces and nephews and grandkids. Some of you folks are young enough to be deployed. We owe you the best we can give you. And that's what I'm trying to do. And let's go on the ride together. That's it. That's my end of speech.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Here.
And we're going to go ahead and break for lunch now. We will resume at 1 o'clock. So we will see you guys online shortly.